Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us this morning for LaRSSA's web chat. Today, we are going to look at linear servitude rehabilitation risks and opportunities. And it is going to be presented by our very own president for the LaRSSA Council, Gwen Gosney. And for those of you who haven't met Gwen or don't know her background, I'll just give her a brief introduction before we proceed with the presentation. Gwen has a master's degree in environmental management through the University of Free State and a BTech in nature conservation from the Cape University of Technology. And after she started her career at the South African National Parks, she then worked in a range of roles before settling at the TCTA. And since 2006, she has worked on the environmental and social aspects that relate to large infrastructure developments, primarily subsurface pipelines, which is one of the linear aspects we're going to be discussing today. Currently, her role includes the development of environmental and social management system for the TCTA, and her interest specifically focuses on sustainable development and green growth. So before we get going to start and kick off the talk, just a few housekeeping issues or rules. Please, you'll see that there are the chat's been made available. If you do have a question, please type it in the chat. We will not be, in the interest of time, we will not be allowing people to ask questions as we go, because we then might run out of time to complete the talk. So just to be fair to everyone, we'll let the host or the presenter finish the talk first, but you're welcome to type your questions in the meeting chat or on the Q&A section of the Teams module, and then we'll get to those at the end. All right. Gwen, over to you.
Good morning, Conrad. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Okay, great. I see a few familiar faces in the room. Let's just see if you can see me. Is the camera on or not?
It was, and it disappeared now. Okay.
And it is not. Okay, there we go. All right. Guys, welcome today. It's a bit strange hearing somebody else give you a bio. Just having a quick look through the room, I see there are a few familiar faces. Not that I can see your faces. But yeah, thank you very much. Welcome. I know Conrad has said, we're not going to do too many interruptions during the presentation, but in all honesty, if you guys have got something to add from your perspective, this is a bit of a web chat. It's not a lecture as such. So yeah, if you guys have something pertinent that you'd like to add, specifically if it is related to other linear infrastructure forms, please do give us a hands up, and then yeah, we can manage it from there. I'm sure we'll be able to do our best. Yeah, we're going to keep an eye on time because I can talk a lot about this particular subject. For those of you who know me, you'll know I'm very passionate about this specifically as well. Let's just see. Are you able to find my presentation? Is it in view for you?
Yep.
Okay, I really can't see it, but cool. Okay, I'm gonna
it just disappeared again.
Oh goodness, I'm gonna have to draw a line here. Okay, let me just see. There we go. You got it.
Yes.
Okay, let's see if I can make this work without it disappearing. Let's get the meeting off the screen too, don't we? Okay, great. So guys, welcome. I'd love to know more about who's in the room, but I think it's going to be a bit restricting. So if I can ask you in the chat, if you could maybe just indicate the kind of industry you're from, whether or not you are involved with linear infrastructure or if this is new to you. It's always interesting to be able to see who's in the room. And yeah, welcome. I look forward to sharing what has been a long time and a lot of passion with you. I think it's been about 18, 19 years that I've been involved with pipelines. And you'll see that a lot of the photographs that I'm sharing today are dated. Not only are they very old, but they actually have got the dates on. And I think my main reason for leaving the dates in is so that one realizes that the issues that we're facing are not new. The things that we're doing are not new. But yeah, welcome to my world of or my interest in linear infrastructure. It's all about thinking in lines. It's about thinking outside of the box, down the line, having a bit of vision. But at the same time, it's very important that as a person working in linear infrastructure, whether or not you're working in the rehabilitation element, whether or not you end up with tunnel vision, because that's the last thing we need. Ironically, working down a line, you need a very open mind and a very wide way of thinking. So I'm not going to be able to divulge or go too much into roads and railways. I'm relying from input from the audience for that. My specific interest and passion has been with pipelines, particularly subsurface pipelines. Of recent, the pipeline, or right in the beginning and right at the end here, we've been working with pipelines as a form of conveyancing infrastructure for large interbasin transfers of water. I work for TCTA, who you will see is up here at the corner. We provide infrastructure to the Department of Water and Sanitation, dams and pipelines, so that they're able to convey this valuable resource of water all the way through to the water boards, the municipalities, and if the pipes are not too broken, to the end users. But we really are involved in the bulk supply side of things. But if you think about servitudes, linear servitudes and pipelines, the other part of my experience came from working on the NMPP pipelines. There was the 501 down to Durban, 500 kilometers, which I wasn't too involved in, but at the same time, I was involved in running the 3 inland lines concurrently. So that was a very interesting time for us. Okay, great. Ridzani, I see you're involved with transmission lines. The pipelines often go parallel to the existing transmission lines. So yeah, I'm sure we'll see some transmission lines in the back here. And hopefully while we're chatting, we'll try and identify some of the differences between the kind of rehabilitation for transmission lines and that for the pipelines. I think many of the rehabilitation challenges that we face on these linear projects are because people don't understand the complexity of what a pipeline means. It's a very narrow servitude. It's very easy to access. It's quick up and down in many ways. And people just think, oh, it's a small, narrow band. What can it really do? What's the real problem? For me, it's one of those things where it looks like a little straw and it's so easy to deal with. And I thought in the beginning it was going to be easy. And I see we've got somebody from NCC Environmental Services, and I was with them when I started this pipeline journey. And Dean Ferreira was there, and he said to me, we've got this little job. It's a big pipeline construction. We just need you up there for a few months. And that was in 2006. And I'm still up here dealing with pipelines in one way or another. So what makes a pipeline or these linear servitudes very different is we have a huge number of stakeholders. Each of those stakeholders along that linear infrastructure has got their own needs and expectations. Those needs and expectations often relate to their land use and very much their expectations of how you're going to look after their interests. So that's very interesting. These long narrow servitudes, they cross so many different landscape features. Ones you can see as well as those you can't. We're going to talk about all of these things in detail. Numerous land portions have got this different ownership. We've got some land that belongs to huge commercial farmers, others that belongs to community organizations. Some of it's got informal settlements on it that don't have any original land ownership, but it just settled on those properties. So the topography is another interesting thing, constantly changing, always up and down, literally from left to right. The topography plays a major role in how we design and successfully manage rehabilitation within our servitudes. The range of land uses, we'll see lots of examples just now. And I think anyone who's done any linear infrastructure will always be surprised by the number of land uses that you can find along a straight line. The boundaries and the interfaces along edges is, when I did my master's degree, it was a major finding for me. It's like realizing that this is one of our most sensitive areas, is anywhere where you have an edge or a boundary. And then always there's these access and accessibility constraints that make pipelines different from being able to drive up to another area, a farm, a mining rehab site. You've got security and access control there, but you don't have a problem getting to the point there is generally access provided in one way or another. Typical servitude challenges that we deal with is the suitability of the design of the rehabilitation to achieve its objective. Quality control and supervision, it doesn't help you've got the best designed rehabilitation plans, but the actual implementation and control of these great plans didn't work so well. Slow rehabilitation and lagging construction works. So quite often on a linear infrastructure with pipelines like this, you've got a lot of damage to go and fix, but it really doesn't help when there's lots of technical issues that people have to go back and fix along the pipeline, literally accessing over the rehabilitation that you've just completed. Probably almost got to sign off. Drainage and erosion problems are immense. Impacted soils and impacts on the soil chemistry, the organic content, and just the physical structure of the soil is quite heavy depending on the kind of development that's taken place. Failing access routes, particularly over time, it's not always easy to access. Even if there was an access route that's designed in, sometimes they fail and you can't always get to where you want to be. And then, of course, Mother Nature and Father Time always throw a few interesting curveballs to us when we're trying to do rehabilitation. I think the first and best place to start is understanding the relationship between the receiving environment, the type of disturbance, and the rehabilitation that has to take place. I mean, if we just have a look at this particular picture that we've got here, we really understand that there's a diversity of environments involved here. We've got a road and a transmission line next to us. We're crossing a stream. We're going through a wetland as well as a cropland. And there really is a lot of land use diversity, a lot of ecological differences between this patchwork that we're crossing. And it's really difficult when you've got to come in and have a look at how we limit the risks and make the most of our opportunities in these areas, to really understand that the sensitivity and the changeability of that sensitivity rating is huge. But we have to have a look at how we rehabilitate in terms of planning it. You can't plan rehabilitation up front and think you've done a great job. A lot of people get an EMP after having authorization for a linear infrastructure development like this. We'll go ahead and develop a specification. But we really have to then apply ourselves at that early phase and say, how is this rehabilitation specification going to stand up to the project challenges? The impacts that it's going to get, the nature, the intensity, the extent of the impact, and how long. It's easy to decompact an area that has only been traversed by a small vehicle 2 or 3 times. But when it's been a big haul road for 35-ton ADTs for 3 years, it's a very different specification that you need to apply when you are doing your rehabilitation. So, sorry, I'm just going to ask you just to put that camera off for a while. It's distracting me. So yeah, that's just something I want you to bear in mind, is that different types of linear infrastructure, different types of pipelines, and Gerrit, I see that you're in the room. Welcome. Different types of infrastructure and pipelines have got a different intensity and duration and extent of impact. And this is something we really have to look at carefully when we're planning. I cannot reiterate that enough. Okay, let's see. Okay, typical rehabilitation challenges. There's a lot of planning and planning documentation that always is required. And quite often at the end, I think we look back and we say, well, was this something we really wanted to do? Really needed to do? The suitability of requirements. A lot of these things we're going to have a look at, I've already mentioned. So it's just like sort of a page to put everything together. Poor drainage management, I don't think I've spoken about before, but that's a big thing. But yeah, we're going to go through all of this, and time is often not on our side, particularly with the pipelines. There's a lot of pressure to get construction completed and handed back to the landowners, and so that we can hand the projects over to someone else. So now that time thing for us is a big pressure. But the problem with that is, and the big issue and risk is that your cost, your time, and your quality go out the window if you haven't done your planning properly. And this is where our rehabilitation is often really heavy. When I did my master's, I had a look at what the requirements were for us in planning rehabilitation, and I looked at our authorization conditions and legislation. I looked at all the control and source documents of where the requirements were coming from, and it was very interesting to see that there was a lot of requirements around planning and administration. But that as you got through the nitty-gritty of the work, there was very little required in terms of showing your planning of drainage management, landscaping, vegetation, showing your planning of maintenance, showing your planning of monitoring and evaluation was a total gap. They required method statements for certain things, but not for maintenance or monitoring and evaluation. That was quite interesting. Mitigation measures had to be planned and designed, but they weren't monitored or measured or determined whether or not they were being effective. Our friends auditing and compliance are always there and they're very strong, but I would argue that compliance to a bad requirement is probably more dangerous than non-compliance for the sake of environmental protection. And we might see a few examples of that as we go through. There's always requirements to document and report on your planning and your monitoring, but they don't ask you to document and report how things are going with the interim actions around landscaping and preparation. So it's very interesting to see that there's very little sign-off and acceptance interest during the actual brunt of the main work and the maintenance, but they just want to know that it's planned properly and that it's closed out properly. And that for me is a bit of a gray area, and it's something that we are working to improve on as we go into our new projects with improved controls. So yeah, let's have a look at some of the interesting stuff. Linear considerations, there's always this knock-on effect, this ripple effect. If one thing is not done properly, it has an effect all the way down the line. It's something that we've had to look at and really say, how do we make sure that the variability in our servitudes and our landscapes is catered for properly, and that the knock-on effect down the line, that ripple effect, is dealt with properly? Topography I've mentioned, and soils, vegetation, land use, and the land management philosophy. The land management philosophy is interesting because each different land portion and landowner and land users whose property you cross has got a different philosophy on what should be happening, and they're all experts. So it's very interesting sometimes as the environmental practitioner on a site to come in and have to deal with those various philosophies and reconcile your planning with the expectations of those landowners. In-state planning is often something that we don't consider. My very first pipeline, the specification was to take everything back to grass immediately. But at least a third of the construction servitude was through maize lands. And if anyone knows a maize farmer, you'll know that grass is weed number one. So that really is about making sure that that in-state planning is understood. Quality input information is always very valuable. We get a lot from the impact assessments, but quite often it's exceptionally generic. There's a lot of baseline studies and pre-construction surveys that need to be done to make sure that we properly capture what the baseline conditions are. We need to properly understand the intercepted features, not just of the landscape, but of the farms and of the services that are in the areas that we buried or going through. Then the extent of the boundaries and the edge effects I have mentioned, and I'm going to keep mentioning it. Rework and access control, and the importance of levels and shaping. But if we think about the project life cycle, it's got all these different phases and stages. Right up front though, in the early phase, when we're doing activity planning and design, this is where we really have the greatest potential to impact on our rehabilitation success, because we need to carefully understand the technical activities, the construction activities that are going to be taking place in that landscape, the kind of design of the infrastructure that's going to be built. Having a look at the bottom here, we've got somebody looking down a servitude. It's a pipeline servitude built next to a distribution line. But it's really important about understanding the interplay between these things, the risk factors between the infrastructure that's already in the landscape, what's designed to go in. And what's designed to go in, is it designed for success? Is this something that is fit for purpose and suitable in the landscape? So right up front, early consideration of what the intricacies of rehab might be is very, very, very important. If we do that activity planning, the construction planning, the design of the infrastructure properly, we can limit a lot of those rehabilitation risks that come out later. And the opportunity to de-risk things up front is fantastic. It follows the red line on the graph. But if you haven't done that properly and you've left it and you haven't de-risked your planning effectively, the cost of actually mitigating those risks goes very, very high very quickly. Particularly if you have a look at this middle one here, this is what we call Pine Tree Hill. And you'll hear more about Pine Tree Hill as we go. But this particular project was a pipeline in the Natal Midlands. It has an exceptionally steep slope through this pine forest. But the construction specification that we received with the authorization was to reinstate natural grasslands. So yeah, we'll have a chat about that one later. And then obviously sometimes when we go into our rehabilitation planning, we have to make peace with the fact that we cannot re-establish the original vegetation as it was sometimes. We have a look at this last picture. We're going through the Waterberg there. We've got beautiful bushveld, but we've got this long strip of grassland that's now been established along the construction servitude, partly because we cannot quickly re-establish adult canopy bush, but also because our pipeline infrastructure within the ground is sensitive to disturbance from roots, and we may not plant deep-rooted things in those areas. But again, it's about risks and opportunities and how we present that end use to the landowners and the land managers at the end of the day. This can become a massive bone of contention and a really negative issue when you're first engaging with your stakeholder whose property you're building across. But after a good few coffees, maybe a brandy or two, you might come to the consideration that this is a really good access route when they've got a fire break or need for a fire break or something like that. So it really is about looking for the pros and cons in a situation. We have to ask ourselves, and this is a frustration from many people in the environmental management space. Oh, but it's an environmental thing. This rehab stuff, it's just going to quickly plant grass, and it's this environmental job at the end of the project. And it's okay if we demobilize all the other resources and just leave an environmental officer on site to watch the grass grow. But if we're going to do effective rehabilitation planning, specifically of linear infrastructure, but I think this is common to all rehabilitation planning, we have to really understand that this takes place through the project life cycle and that there are a huge number of interdisciplinary people that do collaborate to give us these successful results. And I'm not just talking about the knowledge and practice areas that are environmental sciences, your rehabilitation specialists, your wetlands, your ecology people. We need specialists who understand scheduling, who understand costing, resourcing, procurement. We really need to make sure that all of these areas we perform well in the way that we specify our rehabilitation, go about resourcing it and planning it. There are a lot of considerations that are not environmental considerations. And the one thing I don't have here seems to be designers. Designers and hydrologists, people who understand the flow of water through a landscape, need to be deeply involved in the drainage management planning of our rehabilitation for closure. Otherwise, we're just not going to get it. There's a lot being said already about the life cycle, but we really need to consider that we need to plan our rehabilitation long into the future as well and have a look at it during the operations and maintenance phase and how we make sure that whatever rehabilitation we have put in now, that we stick to it and we make sure that it is something that is sustainable, that can be looked after in perpetuity, that we're not building in hard structures that are going to erode and suddenly end up lost in the middle of nowhere with erosion gullies washing around them. So it really isn't just an environmental thing. There's a lot of environmental specialists involved in proper rehabilitation planning, but I'd like to urge that it's so much more. It's not something that happens at the end of a project, but that we really have to integrate into it. In terms of understanding who our rehabilitation stakeholders are, I've got this very generic little block up at the top here about how you engage with different kinds of stakeholders. And I did a fascinating exercise in terms of understanding who our key stakeholders are in terms of their ability to influence the rehabilitation outcome on our linear developments, as well as having a look at their interests in our success. What made it important for us to succeed in this particular rehabilitation effort? Excuse me. So if I have a look at that, this little model is something I came up with again after a lot of research and data crunching in stupid times of day. But it really does just say that no matter who you are in the rehabilitation space, whether you're a landowner whose property is being impacted on, whether you're an authority, or whether you're actually the guy on the ground implementing the rehabilitation design, there's certain core interests that are really central to most of us. We want to be paid for what we're doing. We want value for money when we're delivering it. And we want to make sure that there are no unexpected financial impacts or implications on us. You know, we all know about rehabilitation provisioning and making sure there's financial resources, but it goes far beyond that. The landowner on the property wants to know that there's going to be no impact on his actual income potential and earning from that property when it's returned to him. From a communications perspective, our interests are in that we know and understand what is expected of us and what is happening around us. The authorities always want to know what's going wrong and what's planned, but it's very important as well, though, that everybody in the life cycle of rehabilitation has got that common interest in having shared information and communication, not just being told what's happening, but being engaged and invited to participate, to understand, to make a contribution to the common or to the knowledge pool. There's a compliance interest. The authorities, obviously, as this custodians of making sure that we comply with legislation and what's expected of us. The implementers obviously need to comply to their contractual conditions to get paid and to be able to close out their projects. And then obviously our landowners want to make sure that their interests and the laws are complied with, that they're not going to be left with something that is going to put them at risk after a project is completed. And then the environment itself is a key stakeholder, and obviously compliance to our legislation will help protect the interests of the receiving environment, the natural environment. We all like having defined objectives, and those need to respond to our personal interests. And again, it doesn't matter which role player you are, it's very important that you can see your own interests reflected in the project's design and in its rehabilitation design. And obviously, there's a reputational risk that we're all interested in guarding against. And when we unpack this rehabilitation stakeholder analysis, I'm going to draw your attention to the big pink block up top. And the developer here is one of your biggest rehabilitation promoters. These are the guys who really have got a very strong interest over this. And when I'm talking to the impact assessment fraternity or fraternities that are not familiar with rehabilitation, this particular slide or diagram is quite new to them, because often they see a developer as someone who is the causer of the problem. But you have to realize that the person doing the work, the person requiring the infrastructure, the contractor building it, those people have all got a vested interest in it being done properly and being done well. The adjacent landowners and the landowners who are impacted by the infrastructure crossing their properties are also very much interested and an important role player. They want to protect their existing land use, but they are also a massive key to success, because these are the people who know the land intimately. They know the soils intimately. They might not be able to do a very technical soil classification, but if it's a landowner who's been managing his property or his farm for many years, they do understand how it responds to different stresses. The interesting thing about linear rehabilitation is the number of land owners and land portions that we have to deal with. So for us to achieve rehabilitation success and closure, we have to get the agreement and the sign-off from a large proportion of those rehabilitation promoters in the pink block. as a developer, TCTA requires our on-site supervision service providers and things to sign off that they are good with what's happened on the ground and that it is fit for purpose, appropriate and sustainable. Our construction contractors need to put forward a good product that we are ready to sign off, but our landowners and our impacted parties at the end of the day, as well as the authorities, are the ones who've actually got to sign off and say they are now satisfied that this rehabilitation has achieved what it needed to and that it is fit for purpose. The interesting part about that, though, is that your landowner is not always the best judge of character for what your rehabilitation should look like. And you'll see a few examples just now. But in my study, I looked at 3 different pipelines, pipelines 1, 2, and 3, red, green, and blue. You'll have a look here that the pipeline lengths varied quite substantively. The area of servitude in total was only 500 hectares across 3 different pipelines. It's really small. It's not huge. However, that meant 149 different land portions, each of which had to be signed off individually. So that rehabilitation acceptance and closure risk is exceptionally high if you don't have the buy-in of the people who are in charge of the pen that needs to sign off that 149 individual agreements. So that's just a bit of an eye-opener, hopefully, just showing the extent of the stakeholder engagement and the importance of the on-the-ground stakeholder when it comes to making sure that we achieve rehabilitation success. These stakeholders come from many different walks of life, many different economic classes. And yeah, we've all heard the thing, not in my back garden or not in my back, not on my back doorstep. Well, this is how it is. Our linear pipeline developments go through a huge array of land uses. The specifications and the planning from an impact assessment perspective do not always consider the needs and expectations of those land users from a rehabilitation perspective. They all look at it from a construction perspective and irritation and people being frustrated at the noise or the dust. But they're not really looking at a lot of the core issues of what is going to happen with rehabilitation towards the closure of our projects. We've got high-end developments that have existing services that might be disrupted as we're constructing. But we also go through some very rural communities. And I always ask, what is the quality of the planning that's gone into this infrastructure development when you're taking a raw water bulk transfer line through a settlement where there is no access to running water? So that's a very interesting thing around stakeholder engagement when you want to get buy-in. Our construction servitudes, when I say the specifications are not always dynamic enough to cope with the type of end-use planning that our stakeholders need us to account for. We've got vegetable gardens, we've got crop farms, we've got other linear infrastructure owners. But then, of course, there's private properties and golf clubs. This bottom one is a golf club where we had to do some very intricate rehabilitation planning in collaboration with the golf course to make sure that we didn't impact their greens and their fairways too badly. So it really is about making sure that you have a fit for purpose rehabilitation plan. Space constraints. I see Sean Davis is in here, and he's also had some trouble up on the new pipeline that they're planning, always talking about space constraints. And it really is quite something. These photographs are from another project. I think it was the NNPP project through Joburg somewhere here, where we really see the team having to apply construction methodologies and planning, health and safety planning to cope with the intricacies of the space constraints that are involved in some of these construction servitudes. Just a sec. Thank you. So if this is the space constraint during construction, you can imagine that it is equally as important to make sure that the rehabilitation planning is well thought through, that we can't take our time about planning rehabilitation here, but the rehabilitation planning is sometimes about repairing a road, repairing a pavement. and making sure that the infrastructure that was there before is still stable and not impacted. Just to get way leaves to do pipe jacking under live railway lines and things like that is a huge challenge that I'm sure a lot of our engineering guys have experienced. And just the amount of planning and stakeholder engagement that goes into making sure that that happens properly. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that the needs and expectations of people who own and operate in these very narrow spaces are respected and reinstated. When I have a look at the baseline conditions of a servitude when we start, it's often very interesting to see that it's not always what we expected. Some of our requirements for rehabilitation require that we have a weed-free environment on completion of a pipeline project. And I think this top picture with the beautiful cosmos in the background just shows us that our chances of achieving weed-free reinstated land in this particular instance are quite low. Not without some mitigation planning that is going to involve dealing with the farmers on the adjacent land around weed control. The base conditions when we get a pipeline construction servitude often have obstacles in them. These little borrow scars from the original road construction have turned into very useful farm dams that need to be compensated for, and the rehabilitation of these areas needs to take into account that we need to replace the functionality that was in this landscape before we commenced construction. You'll see the guys doing some test pits as they go along the cleared servitude here, and that's to really understand the base conditions within the soil profile. But the base conditions on surface are just as important. Not on this particular property. You can see a bit of waste in this central dam on the big picture. But on other properties on the same pipeline, we found that the existing land user and landowner, excuse me, were not particularly caring of their property. This particular dam over here had pesticide containers in it, farming waste, household waste, a few carcasses, some unidentified containers of toxic substances. But in other areas in the Joburg area where we also have pipelines that we work on, you find that the soils are contaminated by illegal dumping. So it's really, what is our rehabilitation objective in these areas, and how do we manage our rehabilitation planning and expectations? Variability is one of the things in the landscape that I did mention earlier, but it really is about understanding how quickly a soil type can change. Whether we're going from a prepared field through wetlands into different lands, the soil variability is huge. Now, when we go ahead and we're planning our rehabilitation, often our specifications would say, just do some soil sampling along the pipeline and make sure it's representative. How frequently are we supposed to be sorry, I see, Carrie, are the slides advancing for you now? Sorry, I see that there's been a problem. Okay, if I can just get confirmation that the slides are advancing from someone, please.
Gwen, on which slide are you now? The variability one of the soil.
Yeah.
Maybe just pop back and forward so you can see if it moves.
Okay. Baseline conditions.
No, it's still, oh, there we go. Yeah, it is moving. Just slowly.
Okay, so we are on space constraints now.
Yes.
Okay, great. It's obviously just a bit slow. We've talked about baseline conditions. Carrie, are you sorted yet? Okay, I'm going to carry on. Carrie, you'll let us know if there's a problem.
Sorry, we are recording the presentation. So if you are falling behind or the slides not advancing on your side, you're welcome to look at the recording afterwards.
Oh, that's a good idea. Thank you very much, Conrad. And thanks, Carrie. Yeah, if you can just drop out and drop back in again. Much appreciated. Okay, so we chatted quickly about baseline conditions and how important it is to have a proper characterization of your your baseline studies that captures the variability. We've spoken here, and you can see how quickly a little wetland can pop up on your servitude. And the requirements around working in these wetlands and your construction techniques, rehabilitation techniques, are quite different to what you would do in the main areas of your servitude. The soil variability is massive. So I think that's just something that's very important to take into account. We intercept a huge number of different features on the landscape as we go down the servitude. And again, this is a major consideration in designing of your reinstatement or your rehabilitation. So yeah, if we have a look, not all infrastructure that we are intercepting is seen. Some of it can be full of really strange substances that can impact not only on your construction process, but if one goes and damages these subsurface pipelines here, you could very well be having some mine wastewater or something similar decanting into your rehabilitation and obviously impacting on its success. And you may have to make sure that you reinstate all the services that you are intercepting as you go. Whether you're intercepting large scale or small scale crop farms, it's important to understand how you impact on the lives and the livelihoods of people in that particular area, and that your reinstatement program and planning really does help the people who depend on the land to get back into a state of normal operation as quickly as possible. Some of the features that we find along our servitudes can be avoided, but others cannot. So examples like this little concrete dam could be protected during construction, but it does take special planning and requirements to not have to go and reinstate that later. So it's all something that one has to look at during the early phases of planning, what can be protected and what cannot. When we're crossing roads, as I say, one has to be very careful because you don't want to have to go and reinstate tar roads. It's an unnecessary cost and it does take planning. But when we're crossing our wetlands and our streams, it's really important to understand their character and their characteristics to make sure that we are reinstating them in a way that is going to be stable and that ties into the landscape, not just on the banks, but also on the beds of the streams to make sure that they can operate ecologically as intended. A lot of the time when we see infrastructure that goes through wetlands, this last one has got a scour valve. It's a large concrete structure through which we can expel all the water in the pipeline. They're always at the lowest point in the landscape, which always coincides with some kind of stream or wetland. Now, these are particularly sensitive areas, but we have to plan for discharging from a technical point of view into these spaces, and that takes a lot of consideration around the style of discharge, the form of protection, but there's lots to look at with those as we continue. To strip or not to strip, and Gerard Miller's here, he's in the room, he's just done a dissertation on some small HDPE pipelines being used in the oil and gas exploration space, and they limited their risk by planning their construction process to be very quick, but also to limit the extent of the stripping that was done in their area. But stripping is typically something that somebody would say, do a quick walk down of the pipeline, quickly do a search and rescue and take out all the plants of conservation value that can be protected. But if you have a look at this top picture up here, you'll notice that it's not exactly the best time for search and rescue. So by limiting the extent of the area that you're stripping, you're limiting the risk of stripping what should be protected. But there's also different construction techniques that you can apply. So this picture at the bottom is a wetlands crossing. It's a fairly sensitive boggy wetland. So construction people on pipelines, at least this one, were very sensitive to getting their machines full of mud. They realized it wasn't good for the machines. So they also had a lot of interest in getting through the wetlands with the least disturbance, not stripping all the topsoil through the wetlands, but rather putting down bog mats and geotextiles, building their running tracks over that. So really by limiting the soil profile disturbance, they achieved some good results. Stockpiles are another interesting one. When we do strip our servitudes, typically we have on the water pipelines, we've got a stockpile of topsoil or the top layer of soil to the one side of the servitude, and then to the other side we have a layer of what we call fertile soil. It's the stuff that comes out over the trench that we can put back to reinstate the soil profile within the top portion of the trench, where you're going to have a rooting zone. You'll understand it a bit better when I talk about the trenching just now. But stockpiling, as much as it's a good thing, can be a intensive process when it comes to making sure that we're putting in erosion and drainage protection. It's a very intensive process to make sure that it is done effectively, so that you don't spend your entire life having to maintain it, and that you do not lose your stockpiles. If you do stockpiling incorrectly, like we have on this bottom picture, we were going through a low point in a landscape that was traditionally a wetland. The farmer had planted maize into this wetland, so it wasn't as visible as we would have liked it to be. So the stockpiling was a continuous stockpile in line with the compliance obligation for the particular project. However, we soon found the water accumulating behind the stockpile and managed to flood the farmer's crops. He was not impressed. Access and accessibility across or along the linear servitude is always a big consideration. Interestingly enough, all my pictures here relate to wetlands, but our long servitudes are literally, it's our access to wherever we need to be. So our construction guys who need to access along the servitude to get to different points of work will traverse the servitude up and down all the time. So this is really one of the big impact potential areas, because you've got a lot of compaction as you're going up and down. So it really is about planning optimum access and avoiding areas that you know are going to be challenging to rehabilitate. Access is not always about building a road. This Water King at the bottom here is a particular excavator that had to be used in Johannesburg to cross Natalspruit. It's a pontoon excavator so that it can actually float on the water and excavate at the same time. So that was quite useful. By having this bog mat running track. So bog mats are just wooden pallets or collections of strong wooden pallets that have been packed together. They're easily handleable. You can pick them up with an excavator, move them, place them, and they really are very versatile in terms of providing you with the removable running tracks that you don't have to strip. It spreads the weight of the plant across the soggy surface, and it allows you to traverse those areas without sinking in. Having seen it in practice quite some time before, when I started on a new project, and I really enjoyed working with him before, but when I started on a new project, there was an individual or a contractor who said to us, it's impossible, they cannot be used. They struggled that entire project long, messing in the soil. They had huge rehabilitation issues trying to get imported material that they brought in for building roads out of sensitive areas. And it really did increase the intensity of the work for rehabilitation in those areas by importing unnecessary material. So that was a major concern. But then we also have a look at how we limit the area that we have to access. This picture of the excavator, the running track and the main servitude stops at the back, and they're bringing in pipe that's already concrete coated that they can lay through this area with the minimum difficulty. Typically, they would excavate through these areas, providing small road crossings. If you look carefully, I'm not sure that you can see it, there's flume pipes that are carrying the water underneath through the road here, making it easy to remove at the end of construction. Trenching is one of those things that is very variable. If anyone's a soil scientist and passionate about soil studies, trenches are your friend, because you can see the soil profile. It makes you very happy. I'm not a soil scientist, and all I see when I see trenching like this is a lot of work. Typically solid trench walls where there's a lot of rock, a lot of blasting and excavation that has to be done through hard surfaces. You have greater trench stability, and it's not such a risk for rehabilitation. But the minute that you have to work through wet and soft, we end up with collapsing trench walls that need to be battered back on the sides like this. And one of our major rehabilitation issues on projects does arise if the team doing that excavation and planning have suddenly changed the design of the shape of the excavation without realizing that they have to remove more fertile soil so that we can make planning for backfill, and you end up with material shortages. So that's always an interesting provision. And then how the works are designed. Yeah, we can design our projects to make our lives easier, to make our lives more difficult. And sometimes it's not on purpose. Sometimes it's just we have a knowledge or a practice gap that's really complicated that we haven't quite figured out. I do not personally enjoy river diversions. I find them to be very large and onerous. I've had the privilege of working with teams who know how to do live river crossings and how to flume rivers and big ones and small ones and keep them flowing for the period during which they're constructing. It is an art, it is a science, and it's a little bit of luck as well. But at the same time, some other infrastructure forms or formats do not allow you that opportunity, and you have to find different ways to divert your streams and your rivers around the works. This particular concrete encasement that's happening over here in this very busy picture shows you how busy a narrow servitude can get. Has to stay open for at least 3 months while these guys are working. So the quality of those river diversions is very important. The risks around how those river diversions are managed leads to flooding and trench problems, obviously washing away material, and the longer that these areas are exposed, the more difficult it is to stabilize and rehabilitate them. The way the works are designed into the landscape has got a major impact on what it looks like and how we rehabilitate at the end. We've got a pipe bridge that's having to be constructed across the Volga River in the bottom here. But my favorite customers are these scour chambers in the bottom. If you haven't done your planning well and you've done your engineering design and it's been read on site and it's been placed with the arrow going in the right direction according to the drawing, and your contractor has gone ahead and built it, sometimes you end up with your scours facing the wrong direction. So instead of this middle scour at the bottom discharging into the river and managing and designing the rehabilitated erosion controlled structures around that, they found that they had to go and create this strange channel to bring the discharge water back into the river, back into the stream flow, and of course making the rehabilitation and stabilization of this particular area of the river exceptionally difficult. This is an example of how, this is an example at the bottom of how a scour valve can be designed into the natural landscape with a broad stilling basin, rock lined with no gabions that can collapse, but rather where we can establish grasses and natural vegetation in between and allow it to flow out without major erosion potential. That is an example of great practice. But we also have examples where the designs haven't been integrated into the landscape properly. And we really have to here have a look at whether or not these things were fit for purpose in the early phases. Remember I said the early stages of project planning and design are really important for limiting our risk. So if we look carefully, this very heavy concrete structure with what used to be a gabion erosion protection structure is built on the bend in a river that was already subjected to existing slip circle erosion. Now, that was not a wise thing to do, obviously, but hindsight being an exact science, we can look back, we can learn lessons, and hopefully apply better planning and judgment to the designs of infrastructure going forward, particularly on these linear servitudes. Some of the other scour outlet designs, okay, here's a much nicer picture of our good practice. Some of our earlier projects, we had scour outlets that had these very broad spray formations for releasing water. They required exceptionally intensive erosion protection. So what happened is they changed the design on future projects so that we have a more sort of up and over release that comes into these natural stilling basins. It's a much better option. But on the same project that has such good practice, you can also have bad practice. And it just comes down to the people on the ground understanding the intention of specifications for erosion protection, for stone pitching or rock packing to break the intensity of water. And this is where multidisciplinary collaboration comes in and making sure that the range of professionals involved in designing erosion protection to make sure that our landscapes and our rehabilitated servitudes afterwards remain functional and low risk and low maintenance for the people who have to operate and live in these areas and depend on the land. Drainage management is not always our fault. One of the really tricky things about managing a servitude is you have to consider what's happening in the landscape around you. It's not good enough just to look at the construction footprint. Maybe your trench is going to be intercepting a wetland that's further up a slope and you're going to drain it by accident. It's very important that we understand the implications of what's happening on the land around us. So the inside of the construction servitude on this particular project over here shows no signs of erosion or drainage management problems. It's working well. So I'm not seeing any issues there, except that we had a major rainstorm. The grass and the stuff on the other outside of the servitude had hidden and obscured these little pipes underneath the farm access road. It's a tiny little culvert on a very big, flat, sandy slope or flat area. It was no risk. Nobody picked it up as a potential problem. But the picture just below it over here with a piece of exposed pipe and this yellow tape, that is just on the other side of where this individual is standing at the moment, before it was repaired. So that drainage through that culvert on that private property, just normal stormwater management, has managed to cause major erosion on this flat sandy area, exposing the pipe. It's massive technical risk, and obviously impacting severely on the rehabilitation and the project's costs. So obviously there's going to be a lot of work to come to these areas, to come and do repairs, to have to redo erosion control, to redo grassing, redo backfilling, and make sure that the pipe integrity is still there. So this is a major cost and time impact that has resulted not because we didn't consider drainage management within the pipeline servitude, but rather didn't consider drainage management across the broader landscape. The other examples in this picture are very similar. The top one is water that flowed into the servitude from private property, carving this channel. It was during a cloudburst, so it was unanticipated. The one over here where we have, we've got this chamber over here for one of our valves, and you can see that the slope drainage has a fence across it. The landowner next door changed their drainage management down their slope, put in a new fence along their boundary, and in so doing managed to channel runoff water from that entire slope across our servitude, damaging the already rehabilitated area and causing major cost and time impacts on the project. It's not a risk that was easily identified or easily monitored or controlled, but it did manifest very, very severely and have major impacts. Middle picture at the bottom is why I don't like river diversions. This is a river diversion, believe it or not, that went sadly wrong. The river diversion itself would have been more stable, but again, lots of rain. This particular design flooded and broke 3 times. And again, project management and control didn't pick up the flaw the first time, and they didn't correct the design. It caused bank destabilization. It caused siltation of downstream pans and rivers, all of which had to be rehabilitated, not because they were part of the servitude, but because the servitude's impacts, the activities and the issues within the servitude impact the surrounding environment so substantively. Here we've got an example of a wash where rehabilitated landscapes are draining through a farmer's maize land and causing damage. So it's not just during the construction phase that we have to monitor drainage management, but also during the operations and maintenance of that rehabilitation and the post-construction servitude. For people who are involved in rehabilitation, I'm not going to go into the whole decompaction thing too much, just to say that it's an exceptionally important part of what we do. And the intensity of the disturbance that you've had to go or that you've endured on that particular area is very, very important when you're planning your decompaction. And again, the longer and the more you can limit the amount of compaction that's taking place, the better, The other feature that we often find is that when you start decompacting land, you find all the buried sins, all the waste that wasn't thrown away properly, all the things that were not properly protected. So I think, if we start decompacting and doing the final preparations for rehabilitation, we discover a lot of little sins that need to be addressed and fixed up as we go ahead. Soil preparation, again, I think you might remember the picture in the beginning of the presentation that's had that huge variability across the landscape on this linear infrastructure, saying how do we make sure the soil protection measures and the soil amelioration is fit for purpose at each point for each land use along the rehabilitation servitude. And it's an exceptionally intensive sampling process. We have to compare not only with the pre-construction part of the servitude, but we also have to have a look, more importantly, with linear infrastructure, at what's happening on the outside of the fence at the time of rehabilitation, because obviously the weather, the land use, the climate, they all play a very, very, very important role here. The soil preparation over here, the decompaction has highlighted another little sin in that this is part of the haul road, that's yellow material that's imported that hasn't been removed. And of course, you have to do soil amelioration to compensate for these impacts. Quality of the growth medium is not always great. Sometimes we get beautiful, deep, sandy soils or gorgeous, deep, rich clays, but other times we find ourselves working through highly impacted areas. And for those of you who are involved in mining rehabilitation, you know just how difficult it is to have to rehabilitate in already impacted soils that are not the best growth medium. Having the right tools for the job is essentially important. And again, it comes down to how we're planning what we're doing and what type of land use we're working on. When we're trying to decompact or rip or scarify, do we need a small tractor or do we need these giant tines that can get really deep into the deep rooting zone? It really is about making sure that you have accessibility to the plant. It also doesn't matter that you've got these things there if they're not working properly, not well maintained. So this really goes to making sure that as a rehabilitation planner, we're making sure that we are putting up our hands and asking for the right tools for the job. Often those tools don't belong to us. The land users' property that we are crossing, those land users, those landowners, the farmers are often got the right implements for working their own soils and their own properties. What you do need to consider then is the implications of them getting damaged and how you compensate for that or plan for it. The landforms and levels are particularly important. These servitudes have all been said to be ready for rehabilitation. The top one is Pine Tree Hill that I was talking about, where we had the original specification for indigenous grassing. One of my colleagues had to go through an immense amount of work to be allowed to plant kikuyu, which grows outside the servitude in this area, in non-compliance with the original authorization to be able to stabilize the slope. If they had not done that, they would have had huge problems. So when we are planning our construction and planning our rehabilitation, we really need to look at how people are managing levels and soils. As you can see in these two pictures, there is no provision here for enough material to reinstate the original landscape. Having a look at how we finish and do our drainage management in different parts of the servitudes is also very important. Over here we have an example of a rocky surface through bushveld that's been cleared and grass. It's a very stable example, but just around the corner, the project was struggling to meet a specification where they were being required to remove all rock and stone from the surface. It's really not a good specification to have to meet. It should have been challenged and addressed. And eventually, after some time and a lot of efforts and pain, they did manage to reinstate to something that was more like the natural environment on the outside of the fence. You can also see the erosion control cutoff berms here were obviously not drained. I mean, obviously not designed with proper drainage management principles in place. So you really have to have a look and say, how is it that I'm best equipping this landscape to work? This picture on the end here, whoops, looks like great practice. We've got lots of berms across here trying to keep soil and drainage in good place. But we have to ask ourselves, have they really worked with the contours of the land And can you do that within the limitations of a very long, narrow servitude? It is not always possible. So when you are able to, you do. Otherwise, you need to mitigate your risks appropriately and make sure that what you're designing in is going to protect your rehabilitation. Access routes are always fun and very difficult to rehabilitate. Again, making sure we do proper decompaction where it's necessary and that we limit the risk. By using the bog mats in the bottom here during the construction phase, it does protect your soils a lot. It avoids excessive compaction that later has to be addressed and allows you to lift the bog mats and rip lightly just to decompact the mat, what was caused by the mats. These black clays, this is a stripping picture, but again, it's in the access route section because these black clays are incredible. They're very productive and fertile. They're fantastic. But when you have an access route through them, they are exceptionally difficult to traverse, obviously making it necessary to use some kind of bog mats or something to get through. The value of having those black clays, though, is that because of their soil structure, and their characteristics, when they do dry out, they totally fragment and they don't hold compaction very well. So it really is about understanding the types of soils and the conditions that you're working in when you're planning your rehabilitation of your servitude and your closure. Planting is something that I'm sure a lot of our people are very familiar with when you're working in the rehabilitation space. This is just examples of hydroseeding, making sure you get an appropriate seed mix, that you're seeding at the correct time of year, that you're making sure that when you are putting it down, you're putting it down in a manner that really is going to deal with success. I know we've got tech talks on seeds and seeding coming up, so we're not going to delve into this too deeply. We've got weeds, and we've spoken about weeds before, but weeds are a funny thing. As much as environmental authorizations tell us to maintain weed-free environments and our requirements for looking after our soil stockpiles say you must keep them free of weeds. Quite honestly, the weeds, if they are not allowed to go to seed, like these have been allowed to, if they're not allowed to go to seed, they really do have fantastic soil holding ability, and they are fantastic pioneers who are not necessarily our worst enemy. So it's about understanding the weeds, the role that they have during this disturbed state, and how we can use the rehabilitation process to get rid of them over time and make sure that we have a quality land use afterwards that is preferably weed free. But again, that stems from what's happening on the adjacent properties and how we manage that risk over time. Drainage management, I think, is one of the most tricky areas, and we have spoken about it a little bit before. But when you're working in areas, this particular place is called Ritsbreak Neck. Anyone from TCTA and Makolo project would recognize it. Drainage management through these areas is exceptionally difficult. We've got topography here that would cause any engineer, any land rehab person, absolute nightmares. The pipe construction has had to take place in a gabion embankment that's been built over here, and we have to accommodate water down through this ravine, coming in from the sides at all angles and down the flow. So this was a really, excuse the pun, steep learning curve for the team, and they did a good job of eventually closing out the project, but it was an immense learning curve. These are just other examples of drainage through Ritsbreak Neck, where we had to really learn to read the flow. The natural drainage flow across here seems to be along the bottom of the valley, but we have to cater for water that washes across the servitudes as well. At one point, the erosion protection structures that were put in this particular area thought it wise to take the water down the slope, but hindsight tells us that across the slope would have been a much better option, putting in different erosion control designs. Here is some erosion control design from the opposite end of the servitude, dealing with runoff that's come in from the adjacent land. But then we've got that discharging to the base of these very big gabion structures. So obviously making sure that the design at the base of these gabion structures are the foundations are designed and protected from erosion. You cannot make up for heavy rainfall. This particular erosion that was caused here, they had over 100 mils in an hour. and it was exceptionally difficult to deal with the damage in this landscape. The benefit was that it showed all the issues with our rehabilitation drainage design at once. So what would have slowly manifested over time came down and manifested in one fell swoop, showing us the areas where we needed to improve drainage accommodation. Absolutely. I'm seeing comments saying that, you know, if you change the drainage characteristics and structures of the soil profile, you can, you know, there's also climatic issues. There's a whole host of things that one really does need to take into account when you're dealing with drainage management. It is very, very important that you get the right specialists to assist. This is not something you leave to the operator to put in small berms as they go. If we have a look at this particular situation, you'll find that that's what happened in these two pictures with the scribbles on them. We have some croplands with farm contours on them that have been intercepted by the pipeline Servitude. The team have diligently gone and put in their drainage control berms at a very well and even spaced according to specification. However, they haven't tied it into the adjacent boundary or edge, making sure that they are connecting and reinstating the contour from the farm on the adjacent property to make sure that your final servitude design is fit for purpose, that drains effectively. We seem to have had a few extra pictures jump in here, so that's quite interesting. I obviously lost them during our planning. But over here, we've got, again, somebody's put in the good intention and invested time and energy in putting in a cutoff drain. But this particular drain is only going to aggravate the situation. It's going to intensify the erosion potential of the water that's gaining in this furrow. It's going to lead it to a servitude edge that isn't tied in with the adjacent landscape. And we're going to have major erosion control issues here as well. If we look at the structure in the green background over here where the grass has grown, this rehabilitation is struggling. It hasn't, you know, we've got some corners here where the decompaction and re-topsoiling and things haven't worked very well. But we also have erosion control structures that are hard engineering structures that are not tied in well with the landscape. They are eroding around and being washed out. And I know I'm not a big fan of gabions, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who are very passionate about gabions out there. But these are a specialist thing. If you do not use gabions properly, you are intensifying your issues. We're nearly there, so let's look at monitoring and evaluation. It's very important. And I think all of us like this textbook. Let's have a look if the grassland is reinstated nicely. We can have a look at it and feel happy and satisfied. But in reality, we have to look right down the line, have a look at the patches that are possibly forming in between. And this really requires one getting into the field, going down the length of the servitude, not having a look from the road edge, which is easy access, and looking down the line where the grass obscures all the bare patches. It's about getting your boots dirty, getting into the grass and going for a nice long walk, literally ground truthing the quality of the rehabilitation throughout the servitude. But of course, if you've been with the project since the beginning, you should have done that ground truthing right from the start. When we have droughts and floods, they wreak havoc with us. Here, there's an exclusion plot that was put in just to see if the disturbance on the outside of the servitude what was causing the rehabilitation failure, but it's evident that the grassing hasn't worked inside or outside the exclusion plots. Here we've got a team who've worked very hard to make sure that the farmer has got a good crop of vegetables again. And of course, we have to consider the impact of livestock at the phase of rehabilitation. In many instances where you've got a lot of grass that's being created or a grassy servitude, it is good practice to bring in some herbivores to come and do some defoliation and get some nutrient cycling in and avoid encrusting, but definitely not at the germination phase where we're trying to establish the grass cover. So that's really something to look at. There are always a few surprises that come out. I don't know any of you who've ever done rehabilitation planning. Your farmer's always saying, oh, but I have rooigras, I have Themeda, it's the best grazing grass ever, and I expect you to fully reinstate my Themeda. So anyone who's ever done rehab in these areas, sort of the Highvelds or the Mpumalanga areas, you'll know that the meter is not really easy to establish. But surprise, surprise, in one of our borrow pits on the edge of a stockpile, we suddenly had the meter coming up from seed, like hair on a dog's back. It was a total surprise. It was something we really did enjoy. It gives you a great opportunity to really do research and understand what is happening in the landscape, that it's not always as predicted. We had the opportunity to collect some sods, try and make some plugs, which we try to use in some of the rehabilitation areas on farms which had an interest in re-establishing Themida as quickly as possible. And surprise, surprise, the plugs failed. So if and when the conditions are right and we are able to recreate the right conditions, the grasses will do their thing. But we cannot raise expectations with the landowners that your rehabilitation is going to be able to deliver such success overnight. This is not how it works. If we have a look at other surprises, we can't say in this day and age that high rainfall and intensive rainfall and climate change impacts are unexpected. We know now more than ever that we need to plan for the unexpected. This is a pre-construction picture of an area where a pipeline crossed. This is the rehabilitated landscape afterwards, after installation. You can see they haven't used gabions. They've done stone pitching and re-established grass. And it was done very well, very effectively. It did stand the test of time. But interestingly enough, one has to plan for the conditions, flood conditions as well. So this is the same bridge during a flood. So really interesting to see. It's very difficult, Renee. We can chat about how we budget for the unexpected, but I don't know if we can. We really just have to expect it, the unexpected. Budgeting for it is an absolute nightmare. We'll talk a bit about that just now. Things that help, making sure you've got the right design of your running track. There, you see my pictures moved. Using of bog mats and other technologies and ideas that are brought to you when they come and they're out of the box, they're not quite what you used to. Embrace it and think about it. Limit your stripping as far as possible, changing your soil profile as little as possible. But at the same time, I want you to really think about what we said about limiting the intensity and the duration and the area of impact. Quite often, impact assessment inputs into our EMPs will tell us to reduce the footprint of the construction area as much as possible. It makes it very, very intensive impact, which is very difficult to rehabilitate. If we were allowed, and in some cases we've applied for the opportunity to extend and broaden that impact zone, but it reduces the intensity of the impact, makes it much easier to rehabilitate, and at the end of the day, it turns out to be the more environmentally the best option, environmentally suitable option. Monitoring and maintenance is something that needs to take place over the longer term. And if you've managed your stakeholders correctly, it is possible to get the landowners and the land users involved in the long-term monitoring and risk limitation of those properties, supporting them and compensating them as necessary. Making sure that we have the right indicators and targets is very important. Quite often on these servitudes, we get a specification to achieve 80% grass cover, but we can't do that in areas which are dominated by rock or that have a totally different land use. So it really is about making sure that your monitoring and evaluation program is dynamic enough and deals with the variability that you encounter along that servitude. It's important to design with nature, not only with the contours on the land, but to understand the types of material selection and to try and avoid, where possible, trying to integrate hard engineering structures into dynamic landscapes like rivers and stream beds, unstable slopes. It's very, very important that we do that. Plan for the unexpected. And again, Renee, your question of how do we budget for the unexpected, it is exceptionally impossible. Or it's exceptionally difficult to do. But projects like this, during their defects liability periods, generally have very high budgets or contingency made for addressing issues and risks. And quite often, if there's a good understanding of where the root cause of a problem lies, you can go and get the money from where it's supposed to come from. If your neighbor has been irresponsible in doing something and has caused damage on your property and it's due to negligence, there is an avenue there to help recoup some of those losses. But as a responsible developer, it's about having large contingencies invested somewhere that we can make sure that before we close out that project and hand it over, that it is fit for purpose. But I think the main thing is trying to really have a look at our designs and integrate them properly into an unpredictable landscape. Out of the box thinking, this is an extract from a report by Mike Mentis on one of our projects. It's that same Pine Tree Hill, but it really just shows that by applying non-orthodox good practice, you can limit the risk instead of going with what is the commonly accepted good practice of seeding with indigenous grasses. Really doing your best to limit the risk that you're facing rather than complying with the letter of every provision that is laid at your doorstep. Engage your mind, speak to the intention of that obligation, obviously following the correct amendment processes, but working with the authorities and demonstrating that you as a responsible developer or a responsible rehabilitation specialist are looking out for the best interest of the landscape. Property packs on the linear servitudes are something that we've adopted across our projects. It really is understanding the construction planning from the outset, having a look at the detailed design, having a look at how the technical works are undertaken, but also using that life cycle history. So from the pre-construction survey data, the assets and infrastructure baseline data, all of this gets accumulated into a project or land portion specific folder that spans the lifespan of that property. In there, we've got baseline footage of what the pre-construction land use and land form were like, and we try and match that as close as possible, obviously. And I find that having property by property pack there, it is much easier to get the buy-in. The person that you're dealing with who has to sign off at the end of the day can see the life cycle of pain that they've lived through while you've been working in their back garden and is more willing to accept that you've done your planning and your risk mitigation effectively. It's obviously very important to have sign off at every phase of the rehabilitation process. It doesn't help to come at the grassing phase and see why we have grass establishment issues only to decide we didn't do our decompaction properly. It's important to have those hold points in your rehabilitation design and planning process. And then obviously just managing things throughout their life cycle. Your property pack would show each step of this rehabilitation of Pine Tree Hill, even detailing what was done during construction, during the trenching, and how those risks were mitigated. I have to thank you for the time that you've shared with me. I know it's been a long haul. I see there's a lot of comments and things that have come through in the chats. We can have a look at those now. But really, the rehabilitation, planning, and management of these linear infrastructure developments is definitely a hands-on collaborative partnership that requires great planning and great collaboration all the way through to closure. Okay, so with that, that's the end of me. Thank you. I see someone's clapping. But yeah, I really appreciate it. If there are any questions, points that people would like to raise, we can have a look at the chat and just see where we're at. I'm not sure how busy it's been because I've been a bit distracted. Okay. Yes, Kogi Kogi is the one who had to do the amendment applications for the rehabilitation of Pine Tree Hill and every other project she's worked on. She's very good at doing it, and she's fantastic at making sure that it really does speak to implementability of our projects and making sure that rehabilitation objectives can be effective at the end of the day. Okay. All areas affected by construction should be rehabilitated on completion of construction phase. Also a very important point. The ability to rehabilitate as you go as far as possible is always something that is recommended. But at the same time, we have to balance the need for going up and down the servitude, finishing off the lagging works and doing corrective measures. So that integrated planning of rehabilitation, timing and planning is very important to do that in collaboration with the infrastructure planning. Yeah. Okay, we have some people telling us where they're from and some folks needing to drop off. Sean is also one of the environmental managers on our projects and also going through a lot of planning on these projects. So thank you to Sean for joining us. Beatrice Jordan as well. Thank you. Kathy, third year environmental management students from TIT appreciate the case studies. Fantastic. Okay. Very important for drafting EMPs, attending this kind of discussion. Good. We're looking at the relationship between soil disturbance and its pH. Again, that'll come out in the analysis. It's highly variable depending on what kind of work has taken place in the area. But it is one of the things that we have a look at with our soil design and amelioration. Okay. Okay, so yes, we have some responses to each other. That's great. Thank you. Whoops. I'm glad to see we've got some EAPs in the room. Climate change in KZN has increased rainfall intensity, causing serious challenges with reference to drainage management. Innovative plans are needed. Business as usual certainly no longer works. That is so true, and it's not just in KZN. We've seen it in all of our areas. And as Renee was saying, how do you budget for the unexpected? And I think it's come to the fact that we need to really make sure that our climate mitigation designs are good. We cannot hope for the best anymore. But again, the solution often lies with having a look at what nature does, having a look at how plant stability in the landscape can be achieved. How is nature responding to these things? It's not always necessary to put in hard engineering structures. Okay, thanks. I hope you guys have enjoyed the discussion a little bit. I'm just going to ask Teresa, are you still with us? I know Conrad had to drop off.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry,
okay,
it took me a moment.
Thanks. Thanks, Teresa. I don't see any hands now. Is there anyone else who'd like to ask questions or offer some input from other kinds of servitudes? Okay, looks like I've covered it all. Nobody wants to talk to me. Okay, guys, we'll have to look at the format of our web chats and try and do something. There we go. Okay, we have one hand. Please come in.
Yeah, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. My name is Bangani. I work for Rand Water as a coordinator in environmental rehabilitation. I've seen that you didn't talk about settlement of soil after maybe 3 months, 6 months of completion. It's very common on our side, and I see there's a gentleman who also asked if the trenched area after backfilling becomes a preferred path of water. I see you didn't have that as an issue on your side.
It is an issue on many of the sites. It's not necessarily in the presentation because we had so much to deal with. The subject matter that we've chosen today comes from a study that I did, and it wasn't a particular issue on that site, but it is a common problem on many sites. In our trenching design and backfill design, they do pay a lot of attention to trying to mitigate that particular risk. Quite often ending up, I'm just trying to see if there's any pictures of how it's dealt with here, ending up with a slightly raised area over the pipeline. Again, that has a short-term local impact during that rehabilitation phase, but then if there is any settlement or subsidence, then it is dealt with. On pipelines where we have had those issues, one of the challenges in addressing those issues is the availability of material of the right type, the correct type of material to bring it in and to come and even off and address the lay of the land there. So yeah, it's a very important issue, and this is where your design challenges come in, making sure that not only is your trench compaction done correctly, but that you allow for settlement. And even just, one of the other challenges you have is that you get water moving along these preferential pathways that are created by your trench if your compaction is not done properly, and you end up having underground cutoffs along your trench. So it really does speak to your rehabilitation success being one of the things that you need to factor in during your inspection of your backfill and of your final landscaping and shaping. I think a lot of it, a lot of the risk around subsidence also relates to the type of soils you're dealing with. So it'll be very interesting to continue that conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for now.
Yeah, great. So I'd like to chat offline sometime. It would be great if we could make contact. That would be good.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
All right. Anyone else? There might be things that I've missed in the chat. I see somebody's asking how we get hold of the recording. I'm going to ask Teresa to share it with everybody who's been in the web chat with us today. It's not the only web chat we're doing. We've got another one coming up very soon, looking at infrastructure. Okay, Teresa says she'll share the recording with everyone, looking at the infrastructure that's created during, I think it's during mining. Is that correct, Teresa? William McDonald will be talking to us about how we repurpose some of those infrastructures. I don't know if you've got the write-up or the ad available for us, Teresa, but you can circulate that to all of us who've been in this web chat as well when we advertise the next one. So please just keep a lookout. Part of how LaRSSA is trying to, there we go, pondering on town proclamations. Okay, there we go. You guys can have a quick read. But part of what we're trying to do at LaRSSA is create value for our membership and for people who are not yet our members in terms of having these chats about issues and subjects that are of relevance out there. And it doesn't matter what walk of life you come from, which professional area you're involved in, whether you're an EAP or a rehabilitation specialist or an engineer. LaRSSA really does strive to be a home for everybody and become sort of a community of practice where we have a multidisciplinary approach to dealing with land rehabilitation, but not only just healing the soil and the plants, but the communities and the livelihoods that depend on them. So thank you very much, guys. We have a conference coming up soon as well. Well, not too soon. It's in September. So please be on the lookout for our conference ad. We are going to be opening up the call for abstracts really soon. The previous two conferences ago, we had a look at the role of rehabilitation in addressing climate change and sustainable development. That was an exceptionally good conference where we learned a lot about the role of rehabilitation in a sustainable future. After that, we looked at the networks and partnerships required for that to happen. And our next conference, the theme, we're going to be up in the Sun City area, is having a look at rehabilitation success by design. It's no happy accident. There's a lot of design elements. And how do we pull in that multi-stakeholder environment to make sure that we achieve rehabilitation success? So please, all of you, I'm sure you've got a lot to offer in your own professional areas. If you'd like to do a web chat with us or would like to send us a case study for us to circulate, please look at how you can engage with us and the wider rehabilitation community. Great. Thank you so much for all your assistance. Bring the conference to KZN. Okay, I hear you. I think we're going to have to chat about that in future. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot. Okay, if there is anyone else who'd like to reach out, I'll put my details in the chat. But otherwise, thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you in some of our other web chats. Or pop Teresa an email if you haven't yet got a membership with us. It's not expensive and it's good value for money. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.